You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
Where does freedom of speech end and hate speech begin? Does self-regulation of media need to be scrutinized and strengthened? The ongoing Sudarshan news case that is centered around its controversial UPSC Jihad show has been attracting a lot of media and public attention. This is no longer just about Suresh Chavhanke's show, with the Supreme Court hearings on the matter also seeking more clarity on how to define hate speech, especially in mainstream media, and how to regulate it without ending up with a dangerous censorship regime. Even as the court acknowledged that prima facie the contents of the show vilifies the entire Muslim community and quote-unquote spreads venomous hatred, in its recent hearing on 21st September, it has also expressed its concerns about how its injunction order on the show is not the ideal regulatory method and may go beyond the court's remit. At a time when what any reasonable person would call hate speech is spreading like wildfire on mainstream media without any accountability, this case has also revived important questions about the self-regulatory mechanisms for electronic broadcast channels. Are they as effective as the government repeatedly claims? If not, how do we strengthen its mechanisms? What steps need to be taken to ensure that freedom of speech doesn't turn into an unrestricted license for hate speech on media? And how do we regulate hate speech without interfering with free speech? In this podcast, you'll hear from the Quint's legal editor Vakasha Sachdev and senior advocate, Congress party leader and former Minister of External Affairs, Salman Khurshid. You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline-making news for you. And I'm your host, Shorbari. As we know, the Supreme Court had restrained Sudarshan TV from telecasting its show Bindas Bowl on 15 September. This was a departure from its previous order from 28 August, when the court had said that it must be careful in imposing any prior restraint on speech, since there were already statutory bodies in place to ensure compliance of the broadcasting guidelines. However, after the news channel aired 4 episodes of the UPSC Jihad program claiming to quote-unquote expose the infiltration of Muslims in the civil services with a green signal from the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, which regulates electronic broadcasts, the court was forced to put an injunction order on the show for prima facie breaching the program code that regulates cable television. The contents of the show, in the court's own words, were quote-unquote rabid, and the assertions on the show were also made in quote-unquote wanton disregard of the truth. Now, while a group of right-leaning websites and organizations like Op India, Indic Collective and Upward Foundation have filed an intervention opposing the injunction order against Sudarshan News, raising questions on hate speech jurisprudence, as in whether it's constitutionally permissible for the Supreme Court to judicially legislate what is quote-unquote impermissible speech. The petitioners and the other interveners who are challenging the channel's representation of Muslims in UPSC exams argue that the content and the tenor of the episodes are a clear case of hate speech and that the show needs to be strictly restricted. But before we get to the questions on regulations and censorship, where do we legally draw the line on hate speech and free speech? Unfortunately, the demarcation of permissible speech from hateful criminal conduct is a bit of a muddle in Indian law. And the Quint's legal editor Vakasha Sachdev explains more.
So the the problem with Indian law when it comes to hate speech versus trying to decide whether something is hate speech or permissible free speech is that the concept of hate speech has not been worked into our laws despite recommendations of the Law Commission to do that. Now, because if we look at many other constitutional democracies in other countries which have eventually added this, there's a big historical context to it, right? So obviously within Germany, you see the context of anti-Semitism, of Nazism, which played into that. In the US and other places, there's again a long history of how that's developed. Now in India, interestingly enough, we've had legislation in the IPC dealing with aspects of hate speech for a very long time. You have section 153A, which deals with any attempt to create incite hatred or disfavor against a particular community on the basis of their religion, language, place of origin, gender. That it covers all of these aspects, except for obviously now, for instance, things like gender identity. But it's quite a broad provision already. You have Section 295A, which deals with specifically insults to religion. Section 505 deals with public mischief, which again, is based on communal lines. So, in some level, there already is a certain degree of law on this. But the problem is that these provisions are quite vague, and and because of the fact that they've been quite vague over the years, the restrictions which have been built into how they're supposed to work, the safeguards built into this, have meant that you require an incitement, a very pretty much like imminent incitement to violence for them to be applicable. Now, when it comes to a lot of the kind of hate speech, even the kind of thing which we're seeing, for instance, on the Sudarshan News UPSC Jihad show, there is no necessarily direct incitement to violence. When we look at hate speech, it's about the kind of speech where, even without saying go out and kill someone, it's about the kind of dehumanizing or sort of othering kind of language, the kind of thing where it creates concepts of dual loyalties. It creates questioning in the person's mind about whether the other person, whether the community at question is someone who can actually be safe for you. It doesn't require an incitement to violence for it to be so dangerous. So what's interesting with, for instance, the case in the Supreme Court is that what's being argued by some of the interveners is that what you've got to look at is that you've got restrictions under Article 19 of the Constitution, which can be put in place for a variety of things. Now, while the regular one, which is used to justify 153A and Section 505 and others, is public order, which is why there's a sort of tie-in to imminent violence when it comes to those. Or you have to also, one of the other restrictions possible is morality. Now, they say don't look at morality as popular public morality, but look at it as constitutional morality. In the same way the Supreme Court has defined the concept of constitutional morality over the years, the way it was used, for instance, in the Section 377 judgment, right? Now, what they're saying is that when you're looking at constitutional morality, the protection of particular communities, both sort of the literal protection of them from harm, which comes under Article 21, as well as the creation of conditions where that harm comes into play, which is what hate speech does. With a pervasive atmosphere of hate and othering of a community, it creates conditions for violence. It makes it impossible for them to actually enjoy their fundamental rights, whether it's the right to equality, whether it'll be other rights under Article 19. So the constitutional morality question in play here becomes protection of a particular community's ability to enjoy their fundamental rights.
Now, in the recent hearing, while the Supreme Court bench led by Justice D.Y. Chandrachud said that it's concerned about the likely implications of its order in the Sudarshan TV case on free speech, it is also quote-unquote equally concerned about balancing free speech and human dignity. And lauding the court's cautious approach in regulating hate speech and its intentions to draw a fine balance between free speech and regulations, Salman Khurshid, a senior advocate, Congress party leader and a former Minister of External Affairs, says that the court has to decide where ridicule and caricature ends and where hate begins, and if the hate is causing an appreciable harm to somebody.
And I believe that this bench, the Chief Justice Chandrachud, goes very far in freedom of speech. They don't easily accept restrictions placed on free speech, because they keep referring to what they call is a marketplace of ideas. And in the marketplace of ideas, what you have seen from the court repeatedly, there is a reluctance to let the government decide what you can speak and what you can't speak. Right? So maximum freedom to speak must be given, and maximum freedom to speak can sometimes be annoying to somebody else. But mere annoyance is not enough. It has to be something more. It has to be something that creates harm. Of course, somebody will have to decide what harm means. It cannot be subjective. It has to be decided by a judge as to what is harmful. Much of what has been said in this case is being argued is harmful. That you're not merely ridiculing, you're not merely opposing something, but you're actually creating a false impression that can be both physically and psychologically, and certainly in terms of it being socially and politically extremely harmful, psychologically and so on, for the person who's attacked. And what you need to take into account is that if you are saying something which is on the edge, it must be said in circumstances where the other person has an equal right to respond. Although you're from the media, but media often first decides what the story is to be run, and then puts a person into the witness box, or puts them into the accused box, and says, "Do you have anything to say in your defense," etc. That's not an equal answer, and that is not an equal opportunity to be able to reply. You have to get equal replying opportunities. So if it's a print medium, you must have equal space to reply. If it's an electronic medium, you should have equal time to reply. But this is where things are on the edge. Having said prima facie maximum freedom of speech, so that anything and everything you say, if it annoys or it is unpalatable to someone else, you cannot impose a restriction on it. And for those liberals who are claiming restriction on something which is of an extreme right, tomorrow the same restriction will be imposed on them when they want to say something. And in this, you're often told that if you want to say something that you feel very strongly about, at least don't use strong words. Be a little calm. And the answer that the liberal position gives is, if you feel strongly about something, then you have to say it strongly. You can't be saying, say it politely, say it gently, say it diplomatically, etc. Because if you feel something very strongly, you must say it strongly. The only restriction is that whatever you say, in whichever manner you say, it must not cause actual harm to the other person. And the actual harm could be physical, could be moral, could be psychological, could be social, but it could be political, and it could be democratic, in the sense that what you say and do may be denying him or that person an ability to participate equally in democracy. Only then you have to say that this is not to be allowed.
But how did a show targeting the Muslim minority community in the garb of what they termed as quote-unquote investigative journalism slip through the existing broadcasting regulations in the first place? What kind of regulatory mechanisms do we have in place currently? Well, media in India is mostly self-regulated. The Press Council of India, which is a statutory body, has a code of conduct for press. But television news, on the other hand, is regulated by the Cable Television Network Act and the Cable Television Rules, which again has a set of guidelines called the Program Code, which prohibits violations of decency or attacks on community or religious sentiments. There are also bodies like the National Broadcasting Association, or the NBA, which is again a self-regulatory mechanism that can only hold up those who voluntarily become its members. And in this case, the NBA has confirmed that Sudarshan News is not its member. And taking note of the inadequacies of these self-regulatory mechanisms, Justice Chandrachud termed the existing system as quote-unquote toothless. But even as the court examines whether there's a need to strengthen bodies such as the NBA, the government, represented by Solicitor General Tushar Mehta, has suggested that the court let the government handle matters of regulating electronic and print media, arguing that the self-regulatory mechanisms have by and large been quote-unquote effective and ensures impartiality. But doesn't the Sudarshan News case belie its effectiveness? While the court's hesitance to jump to censorship as the conclusion could arise out of its valid concerns about what the implications on free speech will it be, does self-regulation need to be explored more vigorously? And talking about the court's approach, Mr. Khurshid argues that blanket restrictions, if imposed now, can be misused later.
Yeah, well, the Supreme Court is very carefully, repeatedly saying we don't want to give this power to the state. We want this to be self-regulation. But how do we achieve self-regulation that is effective? right? And the answer he gave when the press council or somebody said, we have a very good system for self-regulation, and the judge then said that if everything is hunky-dory, why are these matters coming to us? Clearly, self-regulation hasn't worked. That's why the self-regulation hasn't worked. Therefore, we have to step in. But we are stepping in to encourage self-regulation. We are not giving this to the government because that's a sliding slope. If you give it to the government, then where does it stop? You don't know. So what they would want to do is self-regulation by the media, and then they would certainly recommend it to the government that you should accept this, you should support it, you should encourage it, and you should advance it. That's what they would do. But they don't want to leave it to the government. At least this is what I can gather from the arguments that have happened. You see, there are fundamentalist arguments on both sides, right? That anything that is unpalatable, let us say, or is disgraceful or disgusting to you, you want it to be banned, right? You can't just hear pleasant things in a democracy. In a democracy, you have to hear unpleasant things also, and therefore, unpleasantness cannot be the basis of restricting free speech. Unpleasantness is not enough. It has to be something that has to fall in the area of harm, and the harm must be such that there is no way of preventing it or of compensating it by giving you an opportunity to say your bit and to counter what the other person is saying. So, Sudharshan was saying, we asked these Jamia people to give us a reply. They said, no, we don't want to give a reply. Or Zakat Foundation said, we don't want to give a reply. Because, reply people don't give because they think by giving a reply, you are legitimizing what the person is saying. You have no control over how they will carry your reply.
Correct.
So, if they give you that 10 minutes to say, you give me 10 minutes, I will answer all that you've said and I will put my point of view across. Then it's fine. But if just simply say, tell us, are you a bad guy or not? And the person says, no, I'm not a bad guy. And then they go back and say, what a horrible man. Not only is he a bad guy, but he says he's not a bad guy.
So what kind of self-regulating avenues do we need to look at now? Mr. Khurshid highlights some of the complex questions that the court will have to look into now.
See, if I had the answer, frankly, I would be appearing in this case. They have said that let's get some independent people together, people who are not partisan in terms of politics or who are not partisan in terms of the social divide, and they come up with something reasonable and something sensible, and we will endorse it. This is what they are trying to say. But generally, I think that there is a lot of resistance to what the court is trying to do, and then the side that is arguing for supporting what the court is trying to do, that side must not get excessively worked up about nothing irritating or annoying or insulting should be said to us. Now, insulting someone, ridiculing someone, and doing a caricature of someone is different from hurting somebody. It's not a question of your feeling hurt. It's a question of your being hurt, right? So the court has to decide that what is happening is actually hurting somebody, not that somebody is feeling hurt. So all these are very complicated issues that have to be examined. I don't know how much the court will be able to examine it, but I'm quite hopeful that the court will do a good job.
If you like listening to this episode, please subscribe to the Big Story playlist for episodic updates. We're live on Apple, Google Podcast, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website and check out the podcast section. For any feedback, shoot an email to podcasts@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.